Hi there, and welcome to the Mindful Messenger Show brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Media Project. My name is Amanda, and today I'm talking to Marlia Cochran about mindful joy finding. So, Marlia Cochran is a pastor, transformational speaker, and author. She received her BA in Christian ministry with a minor in psychology from Azusa Pacific University and an MA in Pastoral Studies with a youth ministry emphasis, while passionately serving students and their families as a youth pastor for 10 years. However, while continuing her education for a Masters of Divinity, Marlia found herself facing a health crisis that nearly killed her, non-exaggeration, and her faith. Disillusioned and raging, she sunk deeper and deeper until she finally surrendered at death's doorstep. Even after miraculous healing, Marlia found herself disconnected and depressed, questioning God's goodness and asking him to restore her white picket fence. The journey he took her on over the next few years not only answered all of her questions in the most surprising way possible, it gave her access to what she'd really always wanted, his joy. And now Marlia is helping other people find that joy and take it back to their communities. Welcome, Marlia.
Hi. So glad to be here with you.
I know. I'm so excited to have you here. I talk about you all the time. Like,
oh, mercy.
All my online workshops. I mean, I learned so much.
The worst client I ever had, her name was Marlia.
Girl, we had fun together and we learned a lot,
So much. It was crazy.
We learned so much together. I learned as much from you as you learned from me, watching you walk this journey. And I'm grateful that you're willing to hop on here and talk about it and hopefully inspire other messengers who, have this desire to put something beautiful into the world and make sense of a story that might not make a lot of sense at first.
Yeah. That's my hope too.
Yeah. So let's start at the beginning. Where were you when you were like, I think I want to write a book or tell my story? Wait, no, you didn't want to tell your story at first.
No. So the funny thing is I think I was thinking back on this, and I think when I was about 20 years old is when I started going, I think I should write a book. And at that point I was, really studying theology and, ministry and all that kind of stuff. And when I entered into graduate school, I was pretty young. I was like 22 when I entered into graduate school. And I was doing a lot of studying about women in ministry and leadership and all that. And so my assumption was that I would write a book either about women in leadership ministry or about youth ministry, like how to, function and do those kinds of things. And so it probably started way back then, but then, life curveballs hit, and that kind of stuff hits the back burner. And I think it was probably about 10 years later when it really kind of started coming back up again. And I think God just really started priming my heart before then to say, this is something I want you to do. It's not going to be about what you think it's going to be about, but I definitely want you to do this. And the funny thing is that when I called you up, I had seen a post from Janae, one of your other clients, on Facebook, and she was like, oh my gosh, I just finished my book with this amazing coach. And it just struck me, and I was like, I need to know that girl. And so I called you up, and my plan when I first called you even was not to write a book about me. And that was, I know, a big conversation that we got to have. But it was to be oh, sweet. Oh Lord. It was painful. It was so painful because my goal was to write, this book of compilation stories of everybody else. And I would just kind of weave it all together and make it pretty. And that's not what ended up happening at all, like not even close. So that was really interesting and fun and, all that good stuff to come back.
But you knew your message. Like you were very clear at the beginning that you wanted to talk about the journey from disillusionment to joy. I remember that from that very first conversation. You were clear on that. You were clear on who you were writing for. It was just the approach was not as powerful as it ended up being.
Well, and I think a lot of it, for me, was out of fear. Like I didn't want people to know my nitty grits. I did not want them to see the whole inside of me, especially being in a pastoral role. You know, that whole, you know, people have a view of pastors a lot of times that they're up on this pedestal and that they've got, you know, this whole thing figured out. And we don't, by the way. We're trying to figure it out too. And so there was a lot of fear in that. And, you know, the irony of the whole thing was that, you know, trying to talk about the disillusionment to joy process and coming from the good girl perspective, because that's really the hook of my book was about being the good girl and having lived that my whole life and then having to expose everything behind that good girl, you know, facade was terrifying to me. I mean, it wasn't even just a little bit scary, it was terrifying. And I would shake a lot and sweat a lot and to
well, I remember you showing up. I remember you showing up at the retreat, and I remember you just having this like fierce energy. Like it was like sharp and pointy.
Yeah. Much like my hair at the time. Like my hair. Because I had this like swoop and then like, you know, spiked out hair and very like, and I had pink in it, and it was very indicative of how I felt. Really, it was, you know, we talk about how our outsides really reflect our insides a lot of time, and that was how I felt, very prickly, and it was my protective layer, and that's, yeah, I mean, I showed up that way because that's how I was for sure. I didn't even realize it, you know, I was just like, oh, it's high fashion, whatever. But really that's who I was.
Yeah.
Fierce.
Yeah, fierce is a good word. And also like you'd been through some stuff. I mean, you were like wore out, you know, and here you were like, let's change the world with this message. Let's help women. And I remember your face when I was like, well, what if you just told your story?
Yeah. Yeah, and in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, that's never gonna happen.
That's never gonna happen.
I'll say yes because that's what good girls do, but no, that's never gonna happen. I'm not actually gonna write that mess. Yeah, I mean, I had come out of a lot of what really kind of spurred the writing of the book was I had come through this huge medical crisis where I had pretty much literally been at death's door. Like the doctors were telling my husband that I was going to die in the hospital, and just to start planning my funeral. And there had been, you know, about a year leading up to that where I was really, really sick and, you know, raging at God. It wasn't just a little bit of anger or bitterness. It was rage towards God. And so having come through that and nearly almost dying and having to kind of reconcile a lot of what was happening and still not being well physically, I was still really kind of in the thick of it and had come through the worst part of like the hospital stay and the drama that was kind of in that situation, but really still in the thick of trying to figure out how to live life not completely healthy and how to manage my health in a way that would be functional, you know, for my family and for myself. And walking into a room that was already on fire when I walked in, like I walked through, I was like, oh, this is gonna be rough. And not because of any other reason, but because of me, because I was resistant. Even though I was walking in willing, I was still resistant. You know, clearly I came in with my own agenda and quickly was challenged on that. But I needed to be because that was definitely really the beginning of a healing that had to happen. It had to happen, not just for my book to be written, but for me personally, to really kind of process what had gone on and what was still going on, and what would then come in the process of me writing this book and in the couple of years following. Yeah. So yeah, it was super powerful, and I'm so thankful that I wasn't allowed to sit in that easy way, you know, because it would have been so much easier to, you know, have people give their stories of disillusionment and joy and me to just kind of weave it together. It's been so much easier. But to be challenged to go deeper and to go to the real story was necessary, so necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I remember asking you, like, well, have you ever had, I mean, besides the health crisis, have there been other times where you've been disillusioned? And I just remember like watching It was like I set a grenade off in you, where you were like,
Oh
oh my God, it's my whole life. And
yeah.
then all of a sudden we started to hear the stories about, not being able to have any more children and
Yeah.
that type of grief and, stuff with old mentors and all of these little things that had piled up to the point that now all we needed was like a massive health crisis to just get you to the point where you were done.
Yeah. Well, and I think that was really interesting too, because I think a lot of people, when they walk into the room and again come in with their own agenda, a lot of times don't realize that their whole lives have been preparing them for this, to really pour it out on pages. And, like you said, having said, okay, so what else may have gone on in your life? And then to start having all of these things come up, just one after the other after that. I'm like, holy moly, like this is no joke business. And to be able to see how, my struggling relationship with my dad, growing up in that history. And I had a lot of people pass away when I was a kid, and having how that really affected my thought of like, because I was raised with the concept of, good girls get good things. And then to see like one after the other of these good things not really happening, of how I expected them to happen. And that was a huge part of the process, was really kind of discovering the expectations that I had set, which really contributed to the disillusionment, which set up the disillusionment, and seeing how, the the relationship with my brothers, leaving because they were so much older than me, and those are all life circumstances that just happen, right? But how I perceived them was very different. And having a crazy ex-boyfriend that was like stalker nuts, and all of these different things, and the mentors that you have these expectations of these people, and they're just human. And yet we put these supernatural things on them that are not necessarily what they can live up to. And then the disillusionment from all these different areas just comes pounding down on you. And especially having been in ministry at that point, and just going, where's the joy in this? Because I know that the Bible says I'm promised this joy, but where is it at? Because I cannot find it anywhere. And for it to just be able to be brought up in the way that it was, and then to be able to pour it onto the pages, was was so cathartic, I think. But that there was so much more, that I didn't even think about at the time, that just kind of would come out, in the sense of, when my daughter was born and having the medical issues that she had, and realizing that that was a huge point of clearly pain, but really the set off of my anger at God, and the rage that would then ensue, after that, when I kind of came into my own health crisis and having to deal with, like you said, the fact of not being able to have any more children, and having to, look at my husband as a caretaker versus my husband, my lover, my, baby daddy, all of those things. He became that, and us having to readjust that relationship. And even him being able to walk with me in the process of this book, and seeing his input was interesting too. And that never would have happened had I gone the route they originally planned to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love it because it's just, it was kind of early on in this process for me. I think you were at my second retreat.
Yeah.
And, it was like the first retreat, Tammy was there. And that was like, this is the work that you're really doing. And then Marlia comes along, and I'm like, wow, like these, because people would always come up to me and say, oh yeah, I've always wanted to write a book. And I'd say, really? What do you want to write about? And they'd say, And I thought, that is just the weirdest darn thing ever. Like, how can you not know? And so here comes somebody who knows disillusionment to joy. But that, to me, from the outside in, I was like, oh, you just told me the journey that you want to take through this book. Like, because you were still in this state of disillusionment. And so it was like, this is what we're up to. I mean, this is really what's standing between you and the joy. And I'll never forget your face when when we mapped it out and you had these 5 parts. I talk about this all the time in my alchemy workshop because it's one of those things where, I mean, you were one of the first ones that taught me to expect this, like when we get the structure right, there is something that happens. It's like a little wink from the sky, like you're on
That's
it.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So here we map out this framework for walking from disillusionment to joy, which you haven't exactly done the whole thing. Like chapters 4 and 5, you were living while you were writing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so we map it out and you're like, Amanda, this is the structure of a lamentation. Like I just taught on this in church, but like the last week.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that was the crazy part is I was doing a study and, and I was journaling a lot, at that point and really trying to listen for God's voice, which was, I tried when I was younger, but it was kind of a foreign concept for me. And I'm journaling and I'm just like, God, I got to preach this thing out and I got to write this book because it's coming up due. And I distinctly remember him saying, check, Lamentations 3. And when I was reading through it, I was like, holy smokes, dude, this is like my book structure. And, especially when we had laid it out in the 5 parts and I'm looking at it going, this is not by accident. There's nothing an accident in this. And the fact that it laid out exactly how my story was going to go. And that it was, the crying out to God, which was, in my book, I talk about how I would sit in a hot tub and rage at God and cry out. And it was in anger, but I was still crying out, and the crying out and then going into the what is, Lamentation talks about, identifying the crisis and complaint is usually how the lamentation is typically worked out and going through that in my what is statements and trying to figure out, the what is of right now and then going into the mourning, the what was and the grieving and I was still kind of in that process when we were laying this out.
Yeah.
And trying to navigate that part of my life. And I remember you saying, you're just going to have to walk this book. You're going to live this book out. You're going to literally live it as you're writing it. And that scared me to death because I'm like,
it scared me to death too.
Lord Jesus help us, because it was like crazy. I'm like, okay, but I know I'm on a schedule. And so God, you better pick up the pace.
Right.
Like you got to pick up the pace of me living this out so that I can write this mess because I'm on a timeline. And so, and God did, he came through. And it was then, getting into the God matrix of it all. And that was where it just blew wide open for me.
So we have to back this up because I think this is magic. And it was so amazing to watch because it was like chapter 1 and chapter 2 flew out of you like nobody's business.
Because I was all past that. I'd already lived it. I was good.
Yeah. You're all talk about the rage. That's easy.
I do rage.
Talk about the lack of the white fence. That's simple.
Yep.
And then, and I watched you, and then we had the funny conversations about like what a good writer you were. That we were having this experience of you like being deep in the story, and then your preacher self coming out and with the lessons. We're like, let's leave the lessons for later.
Yep.
But then I remember you what is it about chapter 3? I swear, if I inventoried all the books I've worked on, I think it's chapter 3 in everybody's book. It's chapter 3 in my book. There's something about it's the one that everyone slams into. It's like, oh, this is where I'm at. This is where I am in the actual living and embodiment of the message. Like you get to write yourself through those next steps, and yours was all about mourning. And here you were, like, isn't it true that you had 2 family members pass during this time too?
Yeah, my mother-in-law was battling breast cancer, and my dad was battling lung cancer as I'm walking through this. And part of my struggle in this was that as I'm writing about grief, I'm literally walking into like a maelstrom of it because they passed away 6 months apart, 5 months apart. She passed away the end of December, and my dad passed away in June. So that's 5 months, right? 6 months. And my husband was extremely close with his mom. She was like my mom and away from mom kind of a thing. And so we were very close, and having to walk that out as a family, and then knowing, hoping my dad had more time, but knowing that he probably didn't. And then literally barely getting our eyes, dry from my mother-in-law passing away to then walking into my dad passing. And it was so hard to have to capture that while living it. And yet at the same time, I can't imagine having not written it while I was going through it, because that's where the most raw emotion came, was walking that simultaneously as to writing it. And I think that that's where, a lot of my healing happened in those situations, is because I was being forced to write it out, and to be able to see the depth of what God was pouring in through me into this book for other people, and having to walk that grief out of that loss,
Mm-hmm.
but then also, not only the loss of them, but the loss of the what could have been, and really kind of thinking through that. And again, that was a huge part of my own story, the loss of what was and what could have been. Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah. I mean, you were like, I don't know why I can't write chapter 3. And I was like, I don't either. And then all this stuff started to come out about all the loss that you were experiencing. And
Yeah.
I remember seeing you and you were like almost like not emotional. Like there was all this stuff. You look like you were in shock is really what you look like, right? Like anyone who's been through any type of loss, first stage shock.
Denial. Yeah. And I think it was, a lot of it was my tendency is to not be emotional. It's to, like, lock it down, shove it down, just don't deal with it again. If you can't think about it, if you don't feel it, it doesn't exist. And I was kind of raised in that. I have 3 older brothers who, would like sock me in the arm if I cried about anything. And so, I was kind of raised in that knowledge of or that thought process of, crying is weakness. And coming into those situations, it really just triggered all of that up in me again. And when my dad passed away, I didn't cry. I was there, in the hospital room, as was my family. And immediately, as soon as he passed away, my brother and I walked out into the hall and we're like, okay, let's get to the details of the funeral and all of that. And my dad had been a firefighter for like 33 years. And so we had this huge kind of production that we went into. And I actually ended up preaching his service and didn't cry. And had people coming up going, how in the world did you just do that? And I'm like, I just did what I did, did my job. And the same thing, previously when my mother-in-law had passed away, I preached her service, part of her service. And just knew that, that I had to be strong for my husband. I had to be strong for my daughter. I had to be strong for the family. And so it was this pinning up of this deep emotion that really what I had to tap into to kind of release it for the book. And yeah, I mean, it was shell shock. It was just complete shutdown. It was, the fear, honestly, that if I went there, that I couldn't come back from it.
Yeah.
I think we talked about going down the rabbit hole, and being so afraid that I was going to go too deep into that rabbit hole that I couldn't extricate myself out. And so that was really, really hard, but it was exactly what I had to walk in order to write that section of the book.
Yeah. So what were the things? Because, I now that I know what I'm up to, people will get on a call with me and they'll be like, well, I know I need to tell my story, but I definitely don't want to live in the energy of my story anymore. And so, what you and so many of the people in that community that was built during that time taught me was kind of like, how do we do that in a safe way? Like so for you, what do you feel like were the most important things that you had in your world that really made it possible for you to actually face all of that stuff? Because that was like 30 some years of pile up that you were looking at.
Yeah, it really was. And I think what was so key for me was that the community that was built at that point, because we were meeting like weekly out at Glen Ivy, and I was able to walk into that room and there weren't expectations. You know what I mean? Like it was such a safe environment, and the people were so safe there, that I think the key is to finding a safe community that will allow you to be where you're at, raw, authentic, in that moment, to be able to say what you need to say without judgment or condemnation. And for me, that was super key, because I was coming from that, having to heal out that good girl mentality of being a perfectionist and having to live up to this ideal person and facade. And to be able to walk into that room and not feel like I had to be that all the time, and to be able to kind of unpack and unload all of this stuff, just like, I mean, it's graphic, but I felt like I would vomit it out onto the floor. And everybody else was like,
about barf bags all the time.
I did, because it was like, I just need to carry a barf bag with me all the time, because I constantly feel like I'm going to throw up, like, you know. And so throat punching and barf bags were my two things. But that was huge for me, was to see modeled that safe place. And because at that point we were all females, there was something super powerful for me in that, because I'd never experienced that. Like I said, I have 3 older brothers, and I have best friends, you know, growing up, and really close female relationships. But there was always still a sense of me that I wouldn't be accepted if they really knew who I was and really knew all of my like dirty ends of things. And so to find a community that you can have that type of relationship with is key. And then also to learning how to be still and sit in the middle of the mess sometimes, because I think for me, I had to sit in the middle of it and acknowledge that it was happening, or that it had happened. And that's hard to do, because we want to live in a sense of denial sometimes. It helps us to kind of function and deal. And I think sometimes for our own functionality, we have to on some level. But when we're entering into a process of wanting to help people walk a journey, the fortunate thing is you kind of have to lay bare that stuff so that they can experience healing. And so I think that sitting still, and for me, journaling, and asking God to just show up. And the God who I knew and had studied and learned about in seminary was, very critical. And I didn't learn about him like that in seminary. My interpretation was that he was very critical and stringent and all of that. And a lot of that was also brought up from, my childhood. But then walking through this process, and in the journaling especially, and reading scripture in a way that I'd never read it before, just cracked wide open just this level of communication that I had between myself and God, and being able to actually then go back into my journals. And I was able to use particular sections of my actual journal in my book, because I was writing out and processing through it. And it was, again, just being able to take it and put it straight into the book. And I think that was really key too, is the being still and journaling it out, and being in a place that, you can be safe and also held accountable. There was a level of accountability too that was really good for me.
Yeah. And I think too, the part about the safety is like that it's a safe place for you to start to unpack things, because I remember moments for you and other people who were in the group at that time where it was like you would say something out loud and then you would hear yourself. We all have those, like, when we got to chapter 4 and you're talking about like the matrix as far as the story that you had built around who God was and who you were. And it was like, there was something in there that wasn't working. Like you had a lie in there somewhere, and it was like we couldn't move through the writing. And then I remember the day where you said it out loud and you were like, I don't actually believe that.
Yeah.
I actually believe that. Oh my,
Yeah.
And I think,
well, and a lot of it, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, keep going.
I was just going to say that a lot of it was around the whole idea that me being sick was punishment for me not being a good girl. Because a few years earlier, I had stepped out of ministry when my daughter was born and needed a break. I was very burnt out and just had to be done for a while. And I'd walked away from ministry, and not in a good way. Like, I hadn't finished well and was just kind of like I'm never doing this again, so don't ask me to, God. And so there was this guilt that I felt from doing it and doing it that way. And so there was a level of me believing that this illness that I had been given, right, that I had been given it, and that it was God's punishment for me not being a good girl. And I can remember, like clear as day, sitting in the circle in that room in Glen Ivy, and Pastor Tammy was there, and I think Yolanda was there, you were there, a few other people were there, and I just remember saying, I think that this is because of this reason. Like, I think that I was given this. Like, what would I do with that information? Like, that he gave this to me as punishment. And I just remember Tammy saying, but what if it wasn't? What if he didn't give this to you as a punishment? What if he was talking to you and giving you a warning that it was coming for you to prepare yourself spiritually? Because just a short time before I got sick, I had this like kind of supernatural experience where God spoke to me and he was like, do you hear me? And I was like, what? And he was like, do you hear me? And I literally walked out of the room and was like, yeah, I hear. And I just kept walking. And that was kind of that quintessential moment that I kept looking back to and going, if I had just listened, was he that, mad at me because I didn't? And Tammy at that moment was like, what if that wasn't what he was saying at all? What if he was, being a good dad and was saying, this is coming. Your body is physically weakened. You're doing all of these things. You're trying to keep up, and your body is going to break down, and you need to prepare yourself. And that was mind blowing for me. Like, it just, like, we're talking about earlier, a grenade kind of being set off. That was the grenade that like was set off and just broke everything apart. And that's when I could write that chapter, because it was that truth that needed to be spoken over the lie that I had been believing. And that was the thing that just wrecked me to the core. Because then I was just like, I have been believing this about him for years. And what has he been wanting to tell me this whole time that I couldn't hear? And so, yeah, it was having to adjust the lies that I had believed, that I had created myself in my own, interpretation of my life and scripture and schooling and all these different things. But it took that moment in that safe community for me to be able to say, what if it's this? And then for somebody else to reflect back to me a truth that I couldn't even see before. And that's where it just, everything shifted. Mm-hmm. And I think that day I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta type it out, kind of a thing. Because I gotta get it out before I forget. So yeah, that was crazy powerful.
Yeah, I remember it like it was yesterday. And I remember just all of us kind of sitting there and letting it sink in, because it was like, that thing that you just couldn't see. And then as you wrote chapter 4, all of a sudden the good girl showed up. So you're talking about like this image of God the Father that you had, and then this good girl. And it was almost like doing that gave you permission to address this other part. And then then the book, like, it was good. You're a good writer. But then it was like, oh my gosh, this good girl, was she in these chapters? And then I remember we're like, we have to get her back in here. And because that was like the thing that once you got that, it made everything else in the book make sense.
Yeah, and then it kind of all fell into line.
What'd you do? Like write the rest of it in 30 days or something to hit
the problem is that I had, when I first started writing, I came to you and I said, I've been writing this book for 2 years, except it's the same sentence over and over again. The first sentence, and I type it out, and that's not good. I erase it. And then I type it out, and I've been doing that for 2 years. And so my goal, I remember I was like, I want to get this done in like 6 months flat. And then 6 months came and went, and I was still processing out. And, you know, this really was, so it was therapy. It was therapy because it ended up taking me 2 years to write the book, or just under 2 years. But we have the big event coming up. And I was just like, I'm gonna get this book done for that because I want to be a part of that. And I had, I think, only written a very, very small amount of the book. And I pretty much wrote the book in 6 weeks after that. And it was just like, I just couldn't stop typing, and it was revisions and edits and all that kind of stuff in there. But I don't even think it was 6 weeks. I think it was like 3 weeks actually. Because I think I'd started working on the first chapter a little bit. And then the last 3 weeks, it was just like I was pounding it out because it just started downloading and just coming and coming and coming, and all of these things just pouring out. And it was because I had to go through all of that first, and kind of process through it therapeutically in a sense, like in that group and stuff, before I could, I think, even give myself permission to put it on paper. And I think that was a lot of what it was. But yeah, it was like that hit and the book was out of me at that point.
Yeah. So how did this process, because, you know, we all come in with our agendas and our expectations for the book and what it's going to turn into, and creating a brand and speaking on stages. And, you know, we all like, there's always this vision that pulls us into the process, right? But it's really rare that that vision fits what actually unfolds. So what did this experience of writing your book actually do for you? Like, what has changed in your world, in your profession, in the way that you operate as a result?
Well, I think, you know, when I came in, I was not really thinking about going back into church ministry, because remember, I'd sworn it off before and had no plan of really doing that again. I was back in church and I was, you know, good with Jesus and stuff, but I had no intention of doing that again. And so really my thought was that I'm going to be on stages, you know, and, you know, doing book signings at bookstores and, you know, all these fancy things. And then I wrote the book and we did the event and it was amazing. And then I went through like a postpartum depression. In a sense, it's like I birthed this book and then I was like, okay, and now I'm done. Like I'm checking out of life for about a year. And I remember us talking a lot about that, about how like we had birthed this thing and then it was just exhausted. We were just exhausted.
Right. Because I finished my book the same month you did. We launched it. We launched our books the same month.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that there was this expectation of being able to jump straight from finishing the book and getting it done and putting it out and doing this, you know, huge push afterwards. And then it was just going to like hit. And everybody was going to be clamoring for me and I was going to have an agent and all this kind of stuff. And none of that happened for me. And in retrospect, that's completely okay, because I needed time to kind of pull myself back together again, because it was such a labor. It was really laboring a child out. And really God used that time to, I had speaking opportunities more than I would have had without having, you know, produced the book. And so I had, speaking engagements, which was always a lot of fun. And it put me in front of audiences that I wouldn't have had access to without the book. I was able to do some radio interviews and some of those types of things. But what it also did is that God really used it to spur my love for the church back up again. And so, you know, where my book ends is I ended up having to do dialysis and all kinds of stuff. And my book ends there with me in the middle of dialysis. And, you know, the hope of having a kidney transplant and, you know, all this kind of thing. And so my book, technically, we did it 5 years ago. It's like, this is the 5th year of it, which is crazy. Like, it feels like I just finished the dang thing. But then, you know, walking in a couple of years later and actually getting my kidney transplant 2 years ago. And that not being part of the book, but that's now part of my story. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to go in and talk about that with the groups and all of that, but God using this to really, like I said, kind of reignite my love for the church again, and being called back into ministry, into a leadership position. to now be an associate pastor at a church, and for God to say, just like when I started this book of like, oh, this is what I'm going to do with this, and being challenged to think a little differently. And that's the process where I'm at now, is that, never in a million years did I see myself as an associate pastor, let alone what God's calling me to next as a senior pastor. And to
own it, girl.
Right. I'm putting it out there now.
You sure?
But knowing that that's what I'm walking towards, is either planting a church or assuming a church in the near future. And that's exciting, but that's all in a lot of ways poured out of what I've learned through writing the book and the process of the book, and being okay with saying hard things out loud and owning those hard things, and being so committed to walking in authenticity even when it's painful. And I think that was huge for me, because actually I think it's one of the things I wrote about in the book, was that when I would speak before, because I spoke a lot before, is that I spoke in a stance of the good girl, saying the things that I knew would be impactful for people and were mostly true, coming from me, my own stories, but I always eliminated some things because I didn't want to come off as, whatever. And then taking the stage after I wrote the book and standing there and just saying, this is who I am. And I hope that I can model authenticity in a way that gives you a place to be authentic and not to be fearful in that. And one of the ministries that I've been involved with is a women's ministry, and purposely creating that ministry as a place where these women could come in raw and real, and to know that they were loved and accepted in that place. And that was the culture that we built in it, and to see the change and the transformation that came at those tables with those women, because I had experienced that in this process, because that was what my book was calling up. And then to be able to see that lived out with these women and to walk that journey with them was amazing. And to then even see how, like I said, how my speaking changed and how my preaching has changed because of it, is again to kind of blow open that idea that, preachers are perfect and all that kind of stuff, but that we're really walking a journey of faith and trying to hear God new every day. And really, it was poured out of, and is poured out of, the journey that I've walked since even having put the book out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been amazing to watch. I mean, because even as a coach, I have there's all of these ideas about what I can see ahead, like, oh, well, she could go off and do this, and she could turn this into this and this. And it's like, I always get to this point where I watch you guys and I'm just like, oh my God, I couldn't have made it up any better.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
It can't get better. Watching you take all of that healing back to your personal life and back to the stage and back to the, it's like, that's where, remember Tam always used to be mad at me for saying go back, right?
Yeah.
But that's what you did. Like you were able to heal that story so that you could go back where you have the most creds, most potential for impact, right?
Yeah.
And the biggest part of your own personal story. I mean, it's beautiful to watch. I'm so excited that you're going to just take on your own church, girl.
Me too. And I'm telling you, it's never in a million years what I would have ever anticipated, dreamt, or asked for, because that was never the plan. You know what I mean? And that's the irony of it, is that, we put these plans into action, and very rarely does it actually come out that way, because there's something better that we can't even foresee so much of the time. But sometimes it takes a rough road to get there. And that just makes the arrival that much sweeter.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you take forward with you in the sense of this piece of, so much of what we talked about, these automatic pilot, these default matrix things that we just had, these beliefs and these stories that we made up when we were little that got compounded over time. So how do you stay mindful of all of that stuff moving forward? Because the book people should know the book doesn't erase all of it. It doesn't make it all better. It doesn't.
Not
So
at all.
what does the rest of the journey look like? Like, how do you continue that mindful practice for yourself?
Well, I think I it's going to sound maybe trite, but I've reread my own book because it cycles up, and you kind of walk the same journey a lot of times, and it looks different, and it's not as rough. Each time it gets easier and easier because you're mastering, what the process that you wrote about. You're mastering it yourself, and so there's been times where I have had to go back and go, okay, this expectation wasn't met, and this disillusionment has come from it, but I don't want to sit in this disillusionment. How do I get to the joy part? And I think it has to be clarified. Joy is not necessarily happiness. Those are two very distinct and different things. Happiness is a now kind of emotion. I'm happy because I'm at a birthday party. I'm happy because I'm at Disneyland. I'm happy because my grass got mowed and it looked nice for Easter. You know what I mean? That's happiness. Joy is even in the middle of a difficult situation, even in the middle of pain or sorrow, that you still have this resonating and core understanding that God is there and he's walking it with you, and that there's a peace to that and a comfort to that. And it doesn't mean that it can't, all hell can't be breaking loose around you, but to know it's going to be okay, even if it doesn't look like I thought it was going to look. And so I've had to revisit that multiple times. I mean, we had a foster son. My husband and I are in the process of adopting through the foster system because biologically I can't have any more kids because of the illness and the chemotherapy that I had to go through. And yet my daughter, has always wanted a sibling. And so we've taken on the process of going through the foster system. And I'm telling you, it's not for the faint of heart, y'all. It's not easy, but I can't imagine not doing it. And we had a little boy with us for just shy of a year. And we were full set in adopting him, thought that that's what was going to happen. The social worker was pretty positive. And then things got twisted up and flipped upside down. And a family member stepped forward that we didn't quite know about. And he ended up being awarded to this family member. And that was utterly and absolutely devastating. And there was a lot of disillusionment that came through that, and pain. And we're still in the middle of walking that out because, he just left us in November. And yet I know that the family member loves him and he's being so well cared for, and that's where he needs to be. But it doesn't lessen the hurt that we go through. And so it's having to go back and revisit this, right? And look at the process again of like, okay, so I can mourn, I have to address the what is, I can mourn the what was, I can go through the whole process of looking at what were the lies that I was trying to believe in this about, God, myself, the situation. And then being able to still say, and yet I still praise God, because knowing that we had him for a season because he needed to know security and love and a different way that he may not have seen otherwise. And it's changed him and it's forever changed us. And so, having to still stay in this process that I wrote about, I have to do my own stuff, do the work that I'm calling other people to do. And for me, honestly, it's about staying, grounded in the Bible, grounded in Jesus, and just knowing that even when it's hard and it's tough, that there's still hope to be had, and that it doesn't have to be this way forever. That it'll smooth out again. It's just a matter of holding on. So that's, I think for me, it's just, again, reminding myself time and time again that it will get better. It will get better.
And also having a sense of humor about it, right? I mean, we were just talking about the recent holiday and how like all these little things bring up all those old stories, and girl shows up and the white picket fence disappears, and it's like we get to keep developing our sense of humor about it. Like, oh yeah, here I am again. Isn't it funny that I was just reading another book the other day, and I literally, like, they had this concept and this tool in there, and I was like, I heard this part of myself go, this is it. This is the answer. This is the fix. And I was like, are you kidding me right now? Are you kidding me? Like, it is a fix. It is going to help. And also, can we not like hang on to it as the end of all suffering? And
Yeah.
who is suffering so bad? I'm not suffering. It was
Yeah.
really, I was cracking myself up at the kitchen table. It's like,
Yeah.
it is hilarious to listen to this now that I know what's going on, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, my husband and I have talked so many times about, even in the middle of the worst parts, we said, if this wasn't so, funny, it would be tragic because, you have to laugh. You just have to laugh sometimes about just really the ridiculousness of everything that is happening here. And you fine-tuning that sense of humor, because without it, man, it would just be wretched, just wretched. And so you have to lighten it, and you have to laugh at yourself. Sometimes have to laugh at the tragedy, and not because you're, being disrespectful of it, but that if you don't, there's no way to get through it. You know what I mean? Like you have to just throw your head back and laugh sometimes, just cackle like a witch. Because that's what I have to do sometimes, cackle like a witch.
I love it. I love it. Well, are there any last gifts of wisdom or insight that you would share with messengers who are deciding to embark on their journey of writing a book and sharing their story and going back into a community that maybe they didn't imagine they ever would?
Well, I think I think that, the initial feeling a lot of time is fear of the unknown. And it is unknown, and that's okay. It's okay for it to be unknown, for you not to understand exactly what the process is going to look like, or for the process to twist up and change up in the middle of it. And that's okay too. Is, if it weren't scary, everybody would do it, right? Everybody would do it. And yet we're called to step into the muck and mire sometimes of our own experience, so that other people can step out of their own muck and mire. And it takes a lot of courage and boldness to do this. And so when it feels like it's overwhelming, hold tighter to the courage, because there's something beautiful that will come out of it that you've never anticipated, could never have imagined. And regardless of what the outcome after the book is, it's almost irrelevant in a lot of ways while producing the book, because it's a healing process for the writer, for the messenger, and it's definitely healing for the ones that read it and pick up the message. And, that's the difference between, messengers and just regular business people in a lot of ways, who are just kind of pumping stuff out. There's a deeper purpose and a deeper calling in it. And a lot of times that's not an easy process, but it is so, so, so worth it. Every tear, every, bead of sweat, every, shaky hand. Huh?
Every throat punch.
Every throat punch. It's worth all of it, because it, again, what results personally is so powerful that you are changed for the better forever. And then it gives you the opportunity to then invite other people into that transformation too. And that is absolutely and utterly magical. And so take the step, do it. Don't hesitate, just step full in, jump in with both feet, because you won't regret it. You won't regret it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for sharing your amazing story and making it so public that I don't feel worried about talking about you all the time. People know that I have your permission to tell these stories. They're just so good.
They're like, this girl does not even exist. She makes her up. That's too nuts. Yeah.
No, it was not
Glad
too.
I could be fodder for that. That's good. I'm glad.
It was perfect. No, it helps so many people to like see, oh, this is what I'm doing. Oh, she slammed into chapter 3 too. Oh.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes.
Yeah.
But you get past it. Keep pressing in. And that's the thing too, is just keep pressing in, because it'll come. It'll come. Just takes time sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Well, good. Well, I have a few rapid fire questions that I ask all of my interviewees.
Cool.
You ready?
Yep.
Okay. So what was the first book or message that changed your life?
I'm going to say the Bible, because really for me, it wasn't just something that I was raised up on. It was something, the Bible is what changed my life. The truths that I've read in there and have lived out have been the deepest transformation for me. And learning how to read out of the Bible a lot of times, and it just being in the DNA of my essence. So yeah.
And what's your favorite book and why?
So there's a book called The Knowledge of Holy by A.W. Tozer, and it's a little book. It's not very big, but it is so powerful that I can read like a page and then I got to step away and like chew on it, because it is so deep and so powerful. And I've read it a few different times. Like first time I ever read it was in college. And I just remember that the professor was like, I need you to write a paper on this. And I think I got through halfway and I came back to him and I was like, there's no way that I can read this whole book in the matter of time that you're giving us, because it's just too rich. And I think because Tozer really challenges the reader to look at God differently and from a different perspective, and to think these deep thoughts that, at different points in my life I wasn't ready for deep thoughts, but it's just such an amazing book that is challenging and just like I said, offers a perspective that I don't think a lot of people kind of gravitate towards. So I think that's my all-time favorite book. Yeah.
And who's your favorite messenger?
There's a woman, her name is Bianca Altman, and she is powerful from the stage. She is real and she is authentic and she speaks truth in a way that you just want to eat it up. And at the same time, you're going, ooh, like that's a little, ooh, but I love to hear her preach, to hear her speak, because she is a messenger and she's walking out this life that is vulnerable and honest, and is something that I admire, because she is doing it with such an authenticity. Yeah.
It's amazing how you can spot it now, huh?
Oh yeah. And when you've seen so much of the inauthenticity and have actually walked it yourself, that's when you're like, oh, I know your games.
Oh, yeah.
I know what's going on. I've lived that. So yeah. But she's definitely real, and I appreciate that a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marlia. I am so glad that you were here to share your story, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. I'd love to hear from you guys, hear what you took away from today's conversation, what little nugget you're going to walk back into your own messenger process with. And also, I want to thank our sponsor, Site Chisel, and remind you guys that they're offering a 10% discount to my listeners with the code MINDFUL10. So that is a wrap for today. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you.